My name is Margaret. I'm 58 years old, and I work in corporate accounting at a medium-sized company in Chicago. Every morning when I walked through those glass doors, I felt my stomach churn with anxiety. Not because of the work. I loved numbers, spreadsheets, and the precision that accounting demanded. No, my anxiety came from knowing I'd have to face another day of cruel comments, mocking glances, and the constant humiliation that had become my daily reality. It started subtly, as these things often do. A comment here and there about how I took up too much space in the elevator, jokes about whether the office chairs could support my weight, snide remarks about how I was getting too old for this job, and maybe it was time for someone younger and more presentable to take my place. At first, I tried to laugh it off, thinking that if I showed I could take a joke, they'd eventually accept me. But the comments became more frequent, more vicious, more personal. The worst part wasn't even the direct insults. It was the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, the way they'd exchange glances when I had to squeeze past them in narrow hallways, the way they'd suddenly become very interested in their phones when I tried to join lunch conversations. I felt invisible and hypervisible at the same time, ignored as a person but scrutinized as a body that didn't fit their idea of what belonged in a professional environment. The breaking point came on a particularly cold Tuesday morning in November. I had arrived early, as was my habit, to get a head start on the monthly reports. I was focused on my computer screen when I heard laughter coming from the break room. Curious, I walked over to refill my coffee cup, only to find 5 of my colleagues gathered around someone's phone, laughing hysterically. As I approached, I caught a glimpse of the screen. It was a photo of me from the company picnic, but someone had edited it to make me look even larger, with the caption, "When you realize the buffet table is closing." They hadn't noticed me standing there yet, so I heard every cruel comment, every joke about how I probably ate everything at the picnic, every suggestion about how the company should implement a fitness requirement for employees. When they finally noticed me standing there, the laughter died abruptly. The awkward silence that followed was deafening. No apologies, no shame, just annoyance that their fun had been interrupted. That's when I realized this wasn't just workplace bullying, it was systematic dehumanization. They didn't see me as Margaret, the woman who had been keeping their books accurate for 8 years. They saw me as a target, a source of entertainment, a reminder of everything they feared about aging and weight gain. If this story of a courageous plus-size woman has already moved you, hit that like button now so more people can watch this video. Before this toxic environment consumed my confidence, I was a different woman entirely. I had started working at Henderson & Associates 8 years earlier, fresh from a difficult divorce that had left me emotionally and financially devastated. At 50, I found myself starting over in a way I never imagined. My ex-husband had controlled our finances throughout our 25-year marriage, leaving me with limited work experience and even less self-confidence. But I had one thing going. For me, I was brilliant with numbers. Always had been, ever since I was a little girl helping my father balance his small business books at the kitchen table. After the divorce, I went back to school, earned my accounting degree with honors, and landed this job at Henderson & Associates. I was proud of myself, finally independent, finally using my brain in a way that mattered. In those first few years, I was respected. My colleagues appreciated my attention to detail, my ability to catch errors that others missed, and my willingness to stay late to ensure everything was perfect. I felt valued, competent, powerful in my own quiet way. Yes, I had gained weight over the years. The stress of the divorce, the long hours of studying, the comfort eating that had become a coping mechanism. But it hadn't seemed to matter then. My work spoke for itself. I had a small apartment that I decorated exactly how I wanted it, with bright colors and plants everywhere. I had a routine that brought me peace, morning coffee while watching the sunrise, evening walks around the neighborhood, weekend visits to the farmer's market. I was building a life that was entirely my own, and it felt revolutionary after decades of living according to someone else's expectations. I even started dating again, tentatively at first. There was Harold, a gentleman I met at the library, who loved mystery novels as much as I did. We'd have long conversations about Agatha Christie over coffee, and he never once made me feel self-conscious about my appearance. He saw me as intelligent, funny, interesting, all the things I'd forgotten I was during those dark months after the divorce. My relationship with my adult children had improved too, without the tension of an unhappy marriage coloring every interaction. I could be present for them in a way I hadn't been able to before. My daughter Sarah started calling me regularly, sharing details about her job and her relationship. My son Michael would stop by unannounced, just to chat and eat my homemade chocolate chip cookies. I was rediscovering myself as a mother, as a professional, as a complete person. But then something shifted at work. New management came in, younger people who seemed to prioritize appearance over competence. The company culture changed, becoming more focused on image and presentation. Suddenly, being good at your job wasn't enough. You had to look the part too. And according to their standards, I decidedly did not look the part. The humiliation hit me like a physical blow. Standing there in that break room, listening to my colleagues mock my appearance while staring at that doctored photo, I felt something inside me shatter. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was the complete destruction of the professional identity I'd worked so hard to build. In that moment, I wasn't Margaret the skilled accountant anymore. I was just a fat, old woman who had somehow fooled herself into thinking she belonged in a place like this. I somehow managed to walk back to my desk without breaking down, but once I sat in my chair, the tears came in waves. 8 years of hard work, 8 years of proving myself, 8 years of thinking I had finally found my place in the world, all of it felt meaningless now. How long had they been making jokes behind my back? How many times had I walked into a room thinking I was among colleagues, when really I was walking into a room full of people who saw me as nothing more than entertainment? The worst part was how it made me question everything. Had they ever really respected my work, or had they just been tolerating me? When they praised my reports, were they being sincere, or were they mocking me behind fake smiles? That photo from the company picnic, I remembered that day clearly. I had felt confident, happy even. I'd worn my favorite blue dress and had genuinely enjoyed myself. Now that memory was poisoned, replaced by the knowledge that even in moments when I felt good about myself, others were seeing me as a joke. I called in sick the next day, unable to face walking through those doors again. I spent the entire day in bed, alternating between crying and staring at the ceiling. I kept replaying the scene in my head, wishing I had said something, wishing I had defended myself, but also knowing that any response would have just given them more ammunition. There's no winning when people have decided you're not worth their basic respect. The physical symptoms were almost as bad as the emotional ones. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on anything. My body felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with weight. It was the heaviness of shame, of feeling fundamentally unwelcome in spaces I had every right to occupy. I avoided mirrors, avoided going outside, avoided anything that might remind me of how others saw me. When I finally did return to work, I felt like I was walking around with a target painted on my back. Every conversation that stopped when I approached felt loaded with meaning. Every glance felt like judgment. I became hyper-aware of every sound I made, the creak of my chair, the tap of my heels on the floor, the rustle of my clothing. I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, invisible. I ate lunch alone at my desk, avoided the break room entirely, and left the building as quickly as possible each evening. The paranoia was exhausting. I started second-guessing every interaction, analyzing every facial expression for signs of mockery or disdain. When a colleague asked me a work-related question, I wondered if they were just looking for an excuse to get close enough to make fun of me later. When someone said, "Good morning," I searched their voice for hints of sarcasm. I was living in a constant state of hypervigilance, and it was destroying me from the inside out. That moment in the break room wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the one that finally broke me. As I sat in my apartment that evening, nursing a cup of tea and trying to process what had happened, other memories started flooding back. Memories I had pushed down, rationalized away, or convinced myself I was overreacting to. There was the time 6 months earlier when I had to attend a client meeting. I had prepared thoroughly, knew every detail of their account, and was excited to showcase my expertise. But when I walked into the conference room, I heard one of the junior associates whisper to another, "Did they really send Grandma Moses to handle the Peterson account?" The comment was clearly meant for me to hear, and it worked. I stumbled through my presentation, second-guessing every point I made, wondering if they were focusing on my words or just thinking about how ridiculous I looked standing there. Then there was the company holiday party last December. I had bought a new dress, nothing flashy, just something that made me feel professional and put together. I thought I looked nice, appropriate for the occasion, but I overheard 2 women from HR talking by the buffet table, making jokes about how someone should have told me that holiday parties weren't come-as-you-are events. They laughed about how I looked like I was trying too hard and wondered out loud if I had raided my granddaughter's closet. The elevator incidents were particularly painful because they happened so frequently. Almost daily, I'd step into an already crowded elevator and hear someone sigh dramatically, as if my presence was a tremendous inconvenience. Comments about making room or squeezing in were constant. One morning, a young man in an expensive suit made a show of pressing himself against the wall when I entered, then muttered something about rush hour sardines that made everyone else snicker. I spent the rest of that day wondering if I should just take the stairs, even though my office was on the 7th floor. The bathroom was another minefield. I'd overhear conversations about letting yourself go and having some self-respect that I was clearly meant to internalize. Women would make pointed comments about how some people didn't seem to care about their appearance anymore, speaking loudly enough for me to hear from inside the stall. The mirror became my enemy, not just because of what I saw in it, but because of how others reacted when they saw me looking in it, as if the act of checking my appearance was somehow presumptuous. Even the office temperature became a source of humiliation. During summer months, when the air conditioning was on high, I'd sometimes put on a light cardigan because I got cold easily. This somehow became evidence that I was high maintenance and difficult to please. Comments about how some people were never satisfied with the office environment were clearly directed at me, as if my basic comfort was somehow an unreasonable demand. The most crushing memory was from my birthday earlier that year. My manager had announced it during the morning meeting, as was customary for all employee birthdays. Usually, this meant cake in the break room and a small celebration. But when my day came, there was no cake, no acknowledgement, nothing. Later, I overheard someone saying they had forgotten to organize anything, followed by laughter and someone else saying, "Well, it's not like she needs more cake anyway." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. These weren't random acts of meanness from strangers on the street. These were people I worked with every day, people who depended on my expertise, people who smiled to my face when they needed something from me. The systematic nature of it was what hurt the most. It wasn't one person having a bad day. It was an entire culture that had decided I was acceptable to mock, dismiss, and dehumanize. That night after the break room incident, I sat in my living room with all the lights off, just me and the glow from the street lamp outside my window. I had reached a crossroads, and I knew it. I could continue as I had been, shrinking a little more each day, accepting their treatment as somehow deserved, or I could find a way to change the situation. But first, I needed to understand how I had let it get this far. The truth was painful to acknowledge. Somewhere along the way, I had started to believe them. Not consciously, but deep down, I had begun to accept that my worth was tied to my appearance, that their cruelty was somehow justified, that I deserved to be treated as less than human because I didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. I had internalized their shame and made it my own. I thought about my younger self, the woman who had left an abusive marriage and rebuilt her life from nothing. That woman had been fierce, determined, unafraid to take up space in the world. She had walked into job interviews with confidence, spoken up in meetings, advocated for herself when necessary. When had I lost that fire? When had I started apologizing for existing? The answer came to me in the quiet darkness of my living room. I had lost myself gradually, one cruel comment at a time. Each snide remark had been like a small cut, barely noticeable at first, but accumulating over time until I was bleeding out my self-respect drop by drop. I had been so focused on just getting through each day, on surviving their treatment, that I hadn't noticed how much of myself I was sacrificing in the process. I realized that my silence had been interpreted as acceptance. By not responding to their cruelty, by trying to laugh it off or pretend it didn't hurt, I had given them permission to escalate. They saw my lack of resistance as validation that they were right about me, that I really was less worthy of respect than anyone else. In that office, my attempts to make myself smaller had only made them bolder. But sitting there in the darkness, I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anger. Pure, clean anger that burned away the shame and self-doubt. I was angry at them, yes, but I was also angry at myself for allowing it to continue for so long. I was angry at a system that judged competence by appearance, angry at a culture that treated certain bodies as acceptable targets, angry at my own complicity in my degradation. I thought about my daughter Sarah, about the lessons I was teaching her through my silence. If she ever found herself in a similar situation, would I want her to shrink away and accept mistreatment? Would I want her to believe that her worth was determined by other people's approval? The thought of my own daughter learning to diminish herself the way I had was unbearable. I also thought about my work, the reports that kept that company running smoothly, the errors I caught that saved them thousands of dollars, the expertise I brought to every project. My value to that organization was measurable, quantifiable, undeniable. Yet somehow, I had allowed them to convince me that none of that mattered because of how I looked. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being their victim. I didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, but I knew I couldn't continue on the same path. Something had to change, and since I couldn't control their behavior, I would have to change my response to it. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I made myself a proper breakfast, something I had been skipping lately due to stress, and chose my clothes carefully. Not because I was trying to please anyone or make myself more acceptable to their standards, but because I wanted to feel strong and professional. I was going to work as Margaret the accountant, not as the victim they had been tormenting. My first decision was simple but revolutionary for me. I was going to stop avoiding spaces that I had every right to occupy. No more eating lunch alone at my desk. No more taking the stairs to avoid awkward elevator rides. No more skipping the break room entirely. I belonged in that building just as much as anyone else, and I was going to start acting like it. When I walked into the office that morning, I held my head high and made eye contact with my colleagues. Some of them seemed surprised by the change in my demeanor. I wasn't scurrying to my desk with my eyes down like I had been doing. I said, "Good morning," with confidence, whether they responded politely or not. I wasn't going to let their rudeness dictate my behavior anymore. At lunchtime, I made a point of going to the break room. My hands were shaking slightly as I walked in, but I forced myself to move with purpose. I heated up my lunch and sat at one of the small tables, just as I had every right to do. When two of the people who had been mocking me the day before walked in, the atmosphere immediately became tense. They clearly expected me to flee, to give up the space to them as I had been doing. Instead, I smiled and nodded politely, then continued eating my lunch while scrolling through work emails on my phone. I could feel their discomfort, their uncertainty, about how to handle my newfound confidence. They had grown accustomed to my cowering, my desperate attempts to make myself invisible. This new version of me, calm, self-possessed, unapologetic, threw them off balance. The real test came when Jake, one of the worst offenders, made a comment about the table creaking under my weight. In the past, I would have gotten up immediately, mumbling some excuse about needing to get back to work. Instead, I looked up at him calmly and said, "These tables were here when the building was constructed in 1987. I think they're probably sturdy enough to handle a lunch plate." My voice was steady, matter-of-fact, completely devoid of the shame and defensiveness they were used to hearing from me. The silence that followed was profound. Jake clearly hadn't expected me to respond at all, let alone with such composure. He mumbled something about just joking around and quickly left the room. I finished my lunch in peace, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had won a small victory. That afternoon, I made my second major decision. I was going to start documenting everything. Every cruel comment, every instance of harassment, every moment when my professional contributions were dismissed or overshadowed by comments about my appearance. I opened a new file on my personal laptop at home and started recording dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes whenever possible. I realized that while I couldn't control their behavior, I could control how I responded to it and how I protected myself moving forward. This wasn't just about standing up for myself in the moment. It was about building a case, creating a record, preparing for whatever actions might be necessary to stop this treatment once and for all. And you, plus-size woman watching this? Have you been through something similar? Share in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more empowerment stories. As the days passed, I began to rediscover parts of myself that had been buried under months of humiliation and self-doubt. The simple act of refusing to shrink away from spaces where I belonged had awakened something powerful within me, a sense of my own worth that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or validation. I started paying attention to my internal dialogue, catching myself when I automatically accepted blame or shame for other people's cruelty. When Jake made another snide comment about my appearance, instead of immediately thinking, "He's right, I am too fat for this place," I found myself thinking, his comment says everything about his character and nothing about my worth. This shift, in perspective, was subtle but revolutionary. I also began to reconnect with the qualities that had helped me survive my divorce and rebuild my life. I remembered how I had researched every aspect of returning to school, how I had studied late into the night to master concepts that came easily to younger students, how I had walked into interviews despite being terrified and convinced them to hire a 50-year-old woman with limited recent work experience. That woman, the one who had refused to give up even when everything seemed hopeless, was still inside me. One evening, I called my daughter Sarah and told her what had been happening at work. I had been too ashamed to share the details before, not wanting her to see me as weak or pathetic. But as I described the situations, I watched her face grow angrier and more determined. "Mom," she said, "you can't let them treat you like this. You're brilliant at what you do. You've taught me to never accept less than I deserve. Why aren't you following your own advice?" Her words hit me like a lightning bolt. I had spent so much energy teaching my children to stand up for themselves, to recognize their worth, to never let anyone make them feel small. Yet here I was, accepting treatment that I would never tolerate if it were directed at them. The disconnect between my values and my actions was staggering. I started researching workplace harassment and discrimination, learning about my rights as an employee. I discovered that what I was experiencing wasn't just mean behavior. It was potentially illegal, creating a hostile work environment based on age and appearance. This knowledge didn't just inform me, it empowered me. I wasn't just a victim of workplace bullying. I was an employee whose civil rights were being violated. I also began to understand that their treatment of me said nothing about my actual worth and everything about their own insecurities and prejudices. People who were confident and secure in themselves didn't need to tear others down to feel better. Their cruelty was a reflection of their own character flaws, not evidence of my inadequacy. This realization was liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For months, I had been trying to figure out what I had done wrong, how I could change myself to become acceptable to them. Now I understood that the problem wasn't with me. It was with a toxic culture that had normalized dehumanizing behavior toward people who didn't fit narrow beauty standards. I started practicing responses to their comments, not defensive explanations or apologies, but calm, confident statements that refused to accept their premise that I was somehow less worthy of respect. When someone made a comment about my age, I would respond with something like, "My 8 years of experience here speak for themselves." When they made jokes about my weight, I would simply say, "I'm here to do my job, not to meet your appearance standards." The most powerful discovery was that their opinion of me only had as much power as I gave it. I had been living as if their approval was necessary for my survival, as if their cruelty could somehow diminish my actual capabilities or achievements. But the truth was that I was the same skilled accountant regardless of what they thought of my appearance. My value wasn't up for debate. It was measurable in the accuracy of my work, the problems I solved, the expertise I brought to every project. With my newfound understanding of my rights and my worth, I began to take small but significant actions to assert my place in that workplace. These weren't grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. They were quiet, consistent acts of self-respect that slowly began to shift the dynamic. The first major moment came during a team meeting where we were discussing the quarterly reports. I had prepared extensively, as always, and had identified several significant discrepancies in the preliminary numbers. In the past, I might have mentioned these quietly to my supervisor after the meeting, not wanting to draw attention to myself or risk being seen as difficult. Instead, I spoke up clearly and confidently during the meeting itself. I've reviewed the Q3 numbers, and I found several discrepancies that need to be addressed before we submit to the client. I went on to detail exactly what I had found and recommend specific solutions. My voice was steady, my analysis was thorough, and my recommendations were sound. There was a moment of surprised silence, not because my analysis was wrong, but because they weren't used to hearing me speak with such authority. Jake started to make a comment about double-checking the work of someone more senior, but I cut him off politely but firmly. I've triple-checked these numbers, and I'm confident in my analysis. We can review them together after the meeting, if you'd like. The meeting continued with my recommendations being accepted and implemented. After the meeting, my supervisor actually thanked me for catching the errors, noting that they could have cost the company significant money if they had gone unnoticed. It was a reminder that my skills were valuable, that I contributed meaningfully to the organization's success, regardless of what my colleagues thought of my appearance. I also started making small changes to how I presented myself, not to appease their standards, but to reflect how I wanted to be seen and treated. I bought some new professional clothes, not because my old ones were inappropriate, but because I wanted to feel confident and put together. I scheduled a haircut and started taking a few extra minutes in the morning to prepare for the day. These changes weren't about conforming to their expectations. They were about honoring myself and showing up as the professional I knew myself to be. When lunchtime came, I continued to use the break room and common areas. But now, instead of sitting alone and trying to be invisible, I brought books or professional journals to read. I would catch up on industry news, review new accounting standards, or work on continuing education materials. I transformed my lunch, break from a time of hiding into a time of professional development. The shift in my energy was noticeable. Instead of scurrying through the hallways with my head down, I walked with purpose and made eye contact with colleagues. Instead of mumbling responses to their comments, I either ignored them entirely or responded with professional detachment. I stopped laughing along with jokes at my expense and stopped trying to make them like me through self-deprecation. One particularly powerful moment came when I was in the elevator with 3 colleagues who had been regular tormentors. They started their usual routine of dramatic sighs and pointed comments about overcrowding. Instead of shrinking into the corner, as I had been doing, I stood tall and said pleasantly, "Good morning, everyone. Beautiful day, isn't it?" My cheerful, unaffected tone completely disrupted their script. They had no idea how to respond to someone who refused to be diminished by their behavior. I also started setting boundaries around what kinds of conversations I would and wouldn't engage in. When someone tried to drag me into gossip about other employees' appearances or personal lives, I would simply say, "I prefer to focus on work-related topics," and redirect the conversation. I refused to participate in the toxic culture, even as a passive observer. These small acts of self-affirmation began to accumulate into something larger. Each time I refused to accept their mistreatment, each time I asserted my right to be treated with basic respect, I was rebuilding my sense of self. I was remembering who I was before they had convinced me to see myself through their cruel lens. As I continued to assert myself and refused to accept their mistreatment, the dynamics at work began to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. Some of my colleagues seemed genuinely surprised by my newfound confidence and began treating me with more respect. Others, however, seemed threatened by my refusal to remain in the victim role they had assigned me, and their behavior actually escalated. Jake, in particular, seemed personally offended by my transformation. He had clearly enjoyed having me as a target for his cruelty, and my refusal to continue playing that role frustrated him. His comments became more pointed, more aggressive, designed to provoke a reaction that would allow him to dismiss me as emotional or unprofessional. During one particularly tense morning, he loudly announced to the office that someone had eaten all the donuts from the break room and wondered who could possibly have done such a thing, while staring directly at me. In the past, I would have been mortified, would have spent the rest of the day wondering if people really believed I had eaten all the donuts, would have skipped lunch to somehow prove my innocence. Instead, I looked up from my computer calmly and said, "Jake, if you have concerns about office food policies, you should probably discuss them with HR rather than making passive-aggressive announcements to the entire office." Then I returned to my work, as if nothing had happened. The silence that followed was deafening, and several colleagues actually looked embarrassed by his behavior rather than entertained by it. This pattern continued for weeks. The more confident and self-possessed I became, the more desperate and obvious their attempts to humiliate me appeared. I started to notice that some of my colleagues were growing uncomfortable with the obvious harassment, that what had once seemed like harmless office banter was now clearly revealed as systematic cruelty toward one person. But the real test came when my annual performance review approached. I had always received excellent reviews based on my work quality, but I was worried that this new dynamic might somehow affect my evaluation. I spent weeks preparing, gathering examples of my contributions, documenting instances where my expertise had saved the company money or prevented serious errors. When I sat down with my supervisor for the review, I was nervous but determined to advocate for myself. I had prepared talking points about my accomplishments, my professional development, and my value to the organization. I wasn't going to let months of harassment undermine the recognition I deserved for my actual work performance. To my surprise and relief, my supervisor gave me one of the best reviews I had ever received. She specifically praised my attention to detail, my ability to catch complex errors, and my professional demeanor even under pressure. She mentioned that several clients had specifically requested to work with me because of my reputation for accuracy and reliability. But then she said something that caught me off guard. "Margaret, I have to ask, is everything okay with you and some of your colleagues? I've noticed some tension lately, and I want to make sure you feel supported here. It was the opening I had been hoping for, but hadn't quite known how to create. I took a deep breath and decided to be honest. I told her about the systematic harassment I had been experiencing, about the comments, the exclusion, the hostile environment that had been created around my age and appearance. I showed her the documentation I had been keeping, the patterns of behavior that went far beyond occasional thoughtless comments. Her reaction was immediate and serious. She was clearly shocked by the extent of what I had been experiencing and apologetic that it had gone on for so long without her knowledge. She assured me that this behavior was completely unacceptable and promised to take immediate action to address it. That conversation marked a turning point. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt heard, believed, and supported by someone in a position of authority. I wasn't just a victim documenting abuse anymore. I was an employee whose rights were being taken seriously and whose contributions were being recognized and protected. In the weeks following my conversation with my supervisor, something remarkable began to happen. As the hostile behavior from my colleagues was finally being addressed through official channels, I found myself with mental and emotional space to rebuild the self-esteem that had been systematically eroded over the past months. I started by reconnecting with activities and interests that had nothing to do with work or other people's opinions. I had always loved reading, but during the worst of the harassment, I had found it difficult to concentrate on books. Now I rediscovered the joy of losing myself in a good mystery novel, of learning new things through nonfiction, of expanding my mind in ways that had nothing to do with my appearance or age. I also returned to my evening walks around the neighborhood, something I had abandoned when my self-consciousness became overwhelming. At first, I was hyper-aware of whether people were looking at me, judging me, making assumptions about my life based on my appearance. But gradually, I began to focus on other things: the changing seasons, the flowers in my neighbors' gardens, the satisfaction of moving my body and breathing fresh air. One evening, as I was walking past the local community center, I noticed a sign advertising classes for adults returning to education or changing careers. On impulse, I went inside and picked up some brochures. I had been thinking about expanding my skills, maybe getting certified in some of the newer accounting software programs, but I hadn't acted on it during the months when I was just trying to survive each workday. I signed up for an advanced Excel course that met on Saturday mornings. Walking into that classroom for the first time, I felt nervous but excited in a way I hadn't experienced in months. Here was a room full of people who didn't know anything about my workplace situation, who would judge me solely on my willingness to learn and my contributions to the class discussions. The instructor was a woman about my age who had transitioned from accounting to teaching after raising her children. She was warm, encouraging, and clearly passionate about helping adults develop new skills. In that environment, my age and experience were assets, not liabilities. My questions were thoughtful, my participation was valued, and my years of practical experience added depth to the class discussions. I excelled in the course, not just because I was naturally good with numbers, but because I approached it with the confidence I was rebuilding. I asked questions without worrying about looking foolish. I offered to help classmates who were struggling with concepts I understood. I participated fully without constantly monitoring how others perceived me. The final project required us to create a comprehensive spreadsheet that could be used in a real business setting. I designed something that solved a common problem I had encountered in my own work, an inventory tracking system that could prevent the kind of discrepancies I regularly caught in company reports. My instructor was so impressed that she asked if she could use it as an example for future classes. Receiving that recognition, based purely on my skills and creativity, with no reference to my appearance or age, was profoundly healing. It reminded me of who I was when I wasn't being constantly diminished by cruel comments and exclusion. I was smart, capable, innovative, and valuable. These qualities hadn't disappeared during the months of harassment. They had just been buried under layers of imposed shame and self-doubt. I started applying this same confidence to other areas of my life. I called Harold, the kind man I had met at the library and had stopped seeing when my self-esteem plummeted. I apologized for my sudden withdrawal and explained that I had been dealing with some work-related stress that had affected my confidence. To my surprise and relief, he was understanding and eager to reconnect. Our coffee dates resumed, and I found myself able to be present in ways I hadn't been during the worst of the harassment. I could engage in conversations about books and current events without constantly wondering if he was judging my appearance or finding me lacking in some way. He treated me with the same respect and interest he always had, which served as a powerful reminder that the cruelty at work was not a universal experience. It was specific to that toxic environment. I also started reconnecting with my children in deeper ways. When Sarah called for our weekly conversation, instead of trying to hide my struggles or pretend everything was fine, I shared what I had been going through and how I was working to overcome it. She was proud of me for standing up for myself and inspired by my decision to document everything and seek support through proper channels. My son Michael noticed the change in me immediately when he stopped by for our usual Sunday dinner. "Mom, you seem different," he said, "stronger somehow, more like yourself." When I told him about the situation at work and how I was handling it, he hugged me tightly and said, "I'm proud of you for not letting them break you. You raised us to never accept mistreatment, and I'm glad you're finally following your own advice." These conversations with my children were particularly meaningful because they reminded me of the woman I had always been underneath the victim role I had temporarily accepted. I was the mother who had taught them to value themselves, to stand up to bullies, to recognize their own worth regardless of others' opinions. That woman had never really disappeared. She had just been temporarily overwhelmed by sustained cruelty. I began to understand that rebuilding self-esteem wasn't just about feeling better about myself. It was about returning to my authentic self. The person I had been before months of harassment had convinced me to see myself through my tormentor's eyes. I was reclaiming my own narrative, my own sense of who I was and what I was worth. With my confidence rebuilding and official support from my supervisor, I began to think strategically about long-term solutions rather than just surviving day-to-day harassment. I realized that while addressing the immediate behavior was important, I also needed to position myself for future success and protection. The first solution I developed was creating an irrefutable record of my professional competence. I began keeping detailed documentation of every project I completed, every error I caught, every process I improved. I compiled client testimonials, supervisor feedback, and measurable results of my work. This wasn't just about protecting myself from future harassment. It was about building a comprehensive case for my value as an employee. I also started expanding my professional network within the company. During my months of isolation and self-doubt, I had withdrawn from colleagues who might have been allies. Now I began reaching out to people in other departments who had worked with me on projects and had always treated me professionally. I discovered that my reputation outside of my immediate team was actually quite strong. Maria from the legal department, who had collaborated with me on several compliance issues, was shocked when I mentioned the harassment I had been experiencing. "Margaret, you're one of the most competent people in this building," she said. "I've never heard anything but praise for your work. What you're describing is completely unacceptable." She offered to serve as a character witness if needed, and shared that she had similar experiences early in her career. Through these conversations, I learned that I wasn't alone in experiencing workplace harassment, and I began to see patterns in how these situations were typically resolved. The people who successfully overcame such treatment had several things in common. They documented everything, they built alliances with reasonable colleagues, they never accepted the premise that They deserved mistreatment, and they used official channels when necessary. I also developed practical strategies for handling future incidents. Instead of being caught off guard by cruel comments, I prepared a repertoire of professional responses that maintained my dignity while making it clear that their behavior was unacceptable. I practiced these responses until they became automatic, so I wouldn't be thrown off balance in the moment. For comments about my age, I developed responses like, "My experience has been an asset to every project I've worked on here." For comments about my appearance, I learned to say, "I'm here to discuss work matters. If you have concerns about my performance, please address them through appropriate channels." For general attempts to exclude or diminish me, I would simply restate my professional qualifications and redirect to work-related topics. But perhaps the most important solution I developed was a plan for my own professional advancement. I realized that staying in a position where I was vulnerable to harassment from the same people indefinitely wasn't sustainable, even if their behavior was being addressed. I needed to create opportunities for growth and advancement that would change the power dynamics entirely. I began researching internal positions that would utilize my skills while placing me in environments with different colleagues and reporting structures. I updated my resume, highlighting the continuing education I had been pursuing and the measurable impacts of my work. I started networking with supervisors in other departments who might value my expertise. I also considered external opportunities, not because I wanted to leave the company, but because I wanted to ensure I had options. I reached out to professional organizations, attended virtual networking events, and connected with recruiters in my field. This wasn't about running away from the problem, it was about ensuring that I had multiple paths forward regardless of how the current situation resolved. The Excel certification I had completed opened doors I hadn't expected. My instructor connected me with other professionals who were looking for someone with my combination of traditional accounting skills and advanced technical capabilities. I started getting inquiries about consulting opportunities and was invited to speak at a local professional development workshop about integrating new technologies into established accounting practices. If you believe that obese women can achieve anything, subscribe to the channel and share this video with a friend who needs to be empowered. The changes in my approach began to yield tangible results more quickly than I had anticipated. Within 6 weeks of my conversation with my supervisor, the hostile environment at work had dramatically improved. Jake, the most persistent harasser, had been formally counseled about his behavior and was clearly walking on eggshells around me. The casual cruelty that had become normalized was suddenly absent, replaced by professional courtesy and, in some cases, genuine respect. The most significant early result was a shift in how my contributions were recognized and valued. During a quarterly review meeting, my supervisor specifically highlighted my role in preventing a major accounting error that could have resulted in significant financial penalties for the company. She mentioned my exceptional attention to detail and professional expertise in front of the entire team, including those who had been tormenting me. I watched Jake's face during this praise, and I could see his discomfort with the recognition I was receiving. For months, he had worked to diminish my credibility and make me seem incompetent. Now, in an official setting, my actual value to the organization was being publicly acknowledged. The contrast between his perception of me and reality was stark and undeniable. My work quality, which had always been high, actually improved as I was no longer operating under the constant stress of harassment. I found myself thinking more creatively about solutions, taking on additional responsibilities voluntarily, and contributing more actively in meetings. Without the mental energy being drained by daily humiliation, I had more capacity to excel professionally. The Excel certification I had completed also began paying immediate dividends. I was asked to lead a project updating our financial reporting systems, something that would have been unthinkable during the months when I was being systematically undermined. The project required both my accounting expertise and my new technical skills, and it positioned me as a bridge between traditional practices and modern technology. Working on this project allowed me to collaborate with colleagues from other departments who knew me only by my professional reputation. Their treatment of me as a respected expert was a stark contrast to the harassment I had endured from my immediate team. They valued my input, implemented my suggestions, and credited me appropriately for my contributions. One particularly validating moment came when the IT department asked me to review their proposed changes to our accounting software interface. They specifically requested my input because, as they put it, I had the perfect combination of deep accounting knowledge and practical technology skills. Being sought out for my expertise, being treated as a valuable resource rather than a AI target for mockery was profoundly healing. The documentation I had been keeping also proved valuable in unexpected ways. When HR conducted follow-up interviews as part of their investigation into the harassment, I was able to provide specific dates, quotes, and patterns of behavior that demonstrated the systematic nature of what I had experienced. This level of detail made it impossible for anyone to dismiss the incidents as isolated misunderstandings or harmless jokes. My personal life also began to flourish as my confidence returned. Harold and I had progressed from coffee dates to longer conversations over dinner, and I found myself able to be fully present in our relationship without constantly worrying about whether I was worthy of his attention. Our discussions about books had evolved into deeper conversations about life experiences, goals, and values. My children noticed the change in me immediately. Sarah commented during one of our phone calls that I sounded like my old self again, strong and confident. Michael mentioned that I seemed happier during our Sunday dinners, more engaged with the world around me. These observations from people who knew me well confirmed that I was indeed returning to my authentic self. The community college instructor who had taught my Excel course invited me to assist with the next session, recognizing my aptitude for both the technical material and helping other adult learners. This opportunity to teach others was incredibly fulfilling and reinforced my sense of competence and value beyond the workplace dynamics I had been struggling with. These early results created a positive feedback loop. As I experienced recognition and respect in various areas of my life, my confidence continued to grow, which in turn made me more effective and assertive in all my interactions. I was remembering what it felt like to be valued for my contributions rather than judged for my appearance. As word of my situation and how I had handled it spread through the company's informal networks, something unexpected began to happen. Other employees, particularly women who had experienced similar treatment, started reaching out to me for advice and support. I realized that my willingness to document harassment and use official channels had created a model for others who had been suffering in silence. The first person to approach me was Linda, a woman in her early 40s who worked in customer service. She had been experiencing age-related harassment from younger colleagues who made constant jokes about her being over the hill and suggested she should retire to make room for fresh blood. She had watched how I handled my situation and wanted to know if she could use similar strategies. I shared my documentation methods with her, explained how I had built my case, and connected her with the HR representative who had been helpful in my situation. Within weeks, Linda had filed her own complaint and was receiving the support she needed to address the harassment she had been enduring. Seeing her gain confidence and assert her rights was incredibly rewarding. Then Maria from accounting, a different Maria than the one in legal, confided that she had been experiencing weight-based harassment similar to what I had gone through. She was younger than me, in her 30s, but had been dealing with cruel comments about her size for over a year. She had been considering leaving the company rather than continuing to endure the treatment. I was able to show her that she had other options. We worked together to identify patterns in the harassment, document specific incidents, and develop professional responses to inappropriate comments. I introduced her to the supervisor who had been supportive of me and helped her understand her rights under company policy and federal law. But perhaps the most meaningful connection was with Janet, a woman in her 60s who worked in the mailroom. She had been experiencing a combination of age and appearance-based harassment that was even more severe than what I had endured. Her harassers had been trying to pressure her into early retirement, making her work environment so hostile that she was considering leaving despite needing the income. Janet's situation was particularly challenging because her harassers were exploiting both ageism and classism. They looked down on her because of both her age and her position in the company hierarchy. But the strategies I had developed were adaptable to her circumstances. We worked together to document everything, identify allies in other departments, and present her case through appropriate channels. What amazed me was how much these conversations helped my own healing process. Teaching other women how to advocate for themselves reinforced my own sense of empowerment. Each time I helped someone else understand their worth and their rights, I solidified my own understanding of these concepts. I also discovered that my experience had given me unique insight into the dynamics of workplace harassment. I could recognize the patterns, identify the tactics used to isolate and demoralize targets, and provide practical strategies for resistance and recovery. This wasn't expertise I had wanted to develop, but it was knowledge that could benefit others. The ripple effects extended beyond individual cases. As more women began documenting harassment and using official channels to address it, the company culture began to shift. Behaviors that had been normalized and overlooked were suddenly being recognized as problematic and addressed through policy enforcement. I started receiving invitations to speak at women's professional groups about workplace harassment and advocacy. My story resonated with women across different industries who had experienced similar treatment. The combination of my professional credentials and my personal experience with overcoming systematic harassment made me a credible and compelling speaker. One particularly memorable speaking engagement was at a conference for women in finance. I shared my story of how I had transformed from a victim of harassment into an advocate for myself and others. The response was overwhelming. Women lined up afterward to share their own stories and ask for advice on handling similar situations. These speaking opportunities also connected me with other advocates and experts in the field of workplace discrimination. I learned about resources I hadn't known existed, strategies I hadn't considered, and legal protections that could benefit the women I was helping. My network of allies and resources continued to expand. The most rewarding aspect of this advocacy work was seeing the women I helped succeed in their efforts to create change. Linda received a formal apology and assurance that the age-related harassment would stop. Maria's harassers were disciplined, and she was transferred to a more supportive team. Janet's situation was addressed so effectively that she decided to stay with the company until her planned retirement age. My success in addressing workplace harassment and helping other women do the same opened doors I had never imagined possible. The speaking engagements and advocacy work had established me as someone with expertise in an area that, unfortunately, many organizations needed to address. This unexpected specialization began creating opportunities that went far beyond my traditional accounting role. The company's HR department approached me about serving on a newly formed committee to address workplace harassment and discrimination. They wanted someone who had personal experience with the issues, understood the practical challenges of reporting and resolution, and had demonstrated the ability to help others navigate these situations successfully. I accepted the position enthusiastically. This committee work allowed me to influence company policies in ways that could prevent other employees from experiencing what I had gone through. We revised the harassment reporting procedures to make them more accessible and less intimidating. We developed training programs that went beyond basic legal compliance to address the cultural attitudes that enable harassment. We created support systems for employees who were experiencing discrimination. My accounting background proved valuable in this work because I approached policy development with the same attention to detail and systematic thinking that I brought to financial analysis. I could identify gaps in existing procedures, anticipate potential problems with proposed solutions, and develop measurable outcomes to assess the effectiveness of our interventions. The regional office of a major women's professional organization invited me to join their board of directors. They were specifically looking for someone who could address workplace discrimination issues and help develop resources for women facing similar challenges. This position connected me with women leaders across various industries and gave me a platform to advocate for systemic change. Through this board work, I became involved in developing a toolkit for women experiencing workplace harassment. The toolkit included documentation templates, sample scripts for difficult conversations, information about legal rights, and guidance on building support networks. My personal experience informed every aspect of this resource, and it was eventually distributed to women's organizations across the country. I also began consulting with other companies that were trying to address workplace harassment and discrimination issues. My combination of professional credibility, personal experience, and practical expertise made me valuable to organizations that were serious about creating cultural change. This consulting work was both financially rewarding and personally fulfilling. One particularly significant consulting project involved working with a large corporation that had experienced several high-profile harassment cases. They brought me in to review their policies, interview employees about their experiences, and recommend changes to prevent future problems. The project lasted 6 months and resulted in comprehensive policy revisions and cultural initiatives. During this consulting work, I discovered that my story resonated with executives who were parents of daughters. When I shared how my experience had affected not just me but my children's perception of workplace fairness, it often created a personal connection that led to stronger commitment to change. My ability to articulate both the human cost of harassment and the business case for prevention made me an effective advocate. The Excel certification that had seemed like a small step in my recovery became the foundation for additional technical skills development. I completed certifications in several other software programs and became known within my industry as someone who could bridge the gap between traditional accounting practices and modern technology solutions. This technical expertise, combined with my advocacy work, led to opportunities to speak at professional conferences about the importance of creating inclusive workplaces in technology-driven fields. I argued that companies that failed to address harassment and discrimination were not only morally wrong, but also strategically foolish, as they were wasting the talents of experienced professionals. My relationship with Harold also continued to deepen as my confidence and sense of purpose expanded. He was proud of the advocacy work I was doing and supportive of the time and energy it required. Our relationship became a source of strength and stability as I navigated these new professional opportunities. My children were amazed by the transformation they witnessed. Sarah often told friends about how her mother had turned a terrible experience into a force for positive change. Michael joked that I had become more accomplished in my 50s than many people achieved in their entire careers. Their pride in my achievements was incredibly motivating. As my advocacy work and consulting projects expanded, I encountered new and more complex challenges that tested everything I had learned about resilience and strategic thinking. The most significant obstacle came when I was invited to testify before a state legislative committee that was considering new workplace harassment protections. The invitation was both an honor and a source of anxiety. This would be my most public forum yet for sharing my story, and I would be facing not just supportive audiences, but also legislators who might be skeptical of the need for additional protections. Some committee members represented business interests that were concerned about the costs and complexity of expanded harassment policies. I spent weeks preparing for this testimony, working with advocacy organizations to understand the political dynamics and develop the most compelling arguments. I knew that my personal story would be powerful, but I also needed to present data, legal precedents, and economic arguments that would resonate with legislators focused on policy implications. The day of the hearing, I walked into the state capitol building feeling nervous but determined. The committee room was packed with advocates, business representatives, and media. As I sat waiting for my turn to testify, I thought about how far I had come from the woman who had cowered in office break rooms, afraid to speak up for herself. When I was called to testify, I began by sharing my personal experience in clear, factual terms. I described the systematic harassment I had endured, the impact it had on my work performance and mental health, and the steps I had taken to address it. But then I expanded beyond my individual story to discuss the broader implications. I presented research showing that workplace harassment costs companies billions of dollars annually in turnover, reduced productivity, and legal settlements. I shared data about the disproportionate impact on women over 40 and the ways that age discrimination intersects with other forms of harassment. I argued that stronger legal protections would actually benefit businesses by creating clearer standards and reducing liability. The most challenging moment came during the question period when a skeptical legislator suggested that people who experienced harassment should simply find another job rather than expecting legal protection. This attitude, that victims should bear the burden of solving harassment rather than holding perpetrators accountable, was exactly the mindset I had been fighting against. I responded by explaining that this approach punishes competent employees for other people's illegal behavior while allowing harassers to continue targeting new victims. I pointed out that when experienced professionals like me were driven from their positions by harassment, it represented a loss of institutional knowledge and expertise that hurt both companies and the broader economy. My testimony was well received by most of the committee, and several legislators specifically thanked me for my courage in sharing my story and my thorough preparation in presenting the policy arguments. The legislation eventually passed, though with some compromises, and I was proud to have contributed to that success. But the legislative work also brought new challenges in the form of public scrutiny. Some news coverage of my testimony focused more on my appearance than my arguments, with comment sections filled with exactly the kind of cruel remarks I had learned to overcome in my workplace. The difference was that now these attacks were coming from strangers across the internet, rather than colleagues I had to face daily. Initially, this broader public harassment was overwhelming. It felt like the progress I had made in building confidence and asserting my worth was being undermined by a much larger audience of critics. I had to develop new strategies for protecting my mental health while remaining engaged in public advocacy. Learn to focus on the supportive responses rather than the cruel ones. To measure success by policy outcomes rather than public approval. And to remember that people who attacked advocates were often those who benefited from maintaining systems of discrimination. The cruelty I received actually confirmed that the work I was doing was threatening to those who preferred the status quo. My family and friends provided crucial support during this period. Harold reminded me that the people making cruel comments online didn't know me personally, and their opinions reflected their own issues rather than my worth. My children helped me understand social media dynamics and develop strategies for engaging positively while avoiding the worst of the negativity. The consulting work also presented complex challenges as I encountered organizations that claimed to want change but were resistant to the fundamental cultural shifts that would be required. Some companies wanted quick fixes that would protect them from liability without addressing the underlying attitudes that enabled harassment. Learning to navigate these political and organizational dynamics required skills I had never needed as an accountant but had developed through my advocacy experience. I became more strategic in my approach, more sophisticated in building coalitions, and more effective at communicating with stakeholders who had different priorities and concerns. Do you see how an overweight woman with determination can change not only her life, but other people's lives too? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for more stories like this. The moment that truly crystallized my complete transformation came 18 months after that devastating morning in the break room. I had been invited to deliver the keynote address at the annual conference of the National Association of Women Accountants, speaking to over 500 professional women about overcoming workplace discrimination and building resilience in challenging environments. As I stood at the podium looking out at the audience, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who had once hidden in bathroom stalls to avoid cruel colleagues was now being introduced as a pioneering advocate for workplace equality and professional empowerment. The contrast was so stark, it almost didn't seem real. My speech that day focused on the theme "From Victim to Advocate," transforming personal pain into professional purpose. I shared my complete story, the harassment, the documentation, the strategic response, and the advocacy work that had emerged from my experience. But more importantly, I talked about the mindset shifts that had made my transformation possible. The day I stopped accepting their definition of my worth, I told the audience, was the day I began to reclaim my power. The day I stopped trying to make myself smaller to accommodate their comfort was the day I began to expand into my full potential. The day I stopped seeing myself as a victim was the day I became an agent of change. The response was extraordinary. The standing ovation lasted several minutes, and afterward, women lined up to share their own stories and ask for guidance. Many of them were dealing with similar harassment, others were struggling with different forms of workplace discrimination, but they all seemed to find hope in my example of transformation. But the real evidence of how completely things had changed came when I returned to work the following Monday. Waiting on my desk was a memo from the company's executive leadership team. They were creating a new position, Director of Workplace Equity and Inclusion, and they wanted to offer it to me. The job description was essentially a formal version of the advocacy work I had been doing informally. I would be responsible for developing and implementing policies to prevent harassment and discrimination, providing support for employees who experienced these issues, and working with management to create a more inclusive culture. It was a significant promotion with a substantial salary increase and direct reporting to the CEO. As I read through the offer, I realized that my tormentors had inadvertently created the very opportunity that would allow me to ensure their behavior could never happen to anyone else in the organization. Jake, who had worked so hard to make me feel worthless and unwanted, would now be subject to policies I would develop and oversight I would provide. The irony was almost poetic. The promotion also represented complete vindication of my approach to the situation. Instead of accepting the harassment or quietly leaving the company, I had documented everything, used appropriate channels, built alliances, and maintained my professional excellence throughout the ordeal. Now I was being rewarded not just for surviving the experience, but for the expertise I had developed in addressing these issues. When the promotion was announced company-wide, the response from my former tormentors was telling. Some seemed genuinely surprised that someone they had dismissed as incompetent and unworthy was being elevated to a leadership position. Others appeared uncomfortable with the idea that the person they had harassed would now have authority over workplace conduct policies. Jake requested a meeting with me shortly after the announcement. I agreed to meet with him, curious about what he wanted to say. He came to my new office, an office with windows and space that reflected my new status, and offered what he called an apology. "I want you to know that I never meant for things to get so out of hand," he said. "It was just office banter, nothing personal. I hope we can put all that behind us and work together professionally going forward." I looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Jake, what you're describing wasn't office banter. It was systematic harassment that created a hostile work environment. The fact that you're minimizing it now suggests you still don't understand the impact of your behavior. Moving forward, I expect all employees, including you, to treat their colleagues with basic respect and professionalism. That's not a personal request, it's a professional requirement." His discomfort was obvious, but so was his understanding that the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. The woman he had tried to humiliate into submission was now in a position to hold him accountable for his behavior. The tables hadn't just turned, they had been completely rebuilt. In my new role as Director of Workplace Equity and Inclusion, I was able to implement changes that went far beyond addressing the specific harassment I had experienced. Within my first year, I had overseen a complete overhaul of the company's policies and procedures, created new training programs, and established support systems that were being recognized as industry best practices. The harassment reporting system I designed was particularly innovative. Instead of requiring victims to navigate complex bureaucratic processes alone, it provided multiple reporting options, guaranteed confidential initial consultations, and offered support throughout the resolution process. The system also included proactive monitoring to identify patterns of problematic behavior before they escalated into systematic harassment. My background in accounting proved invaluable in this work because I approached policy development with the same analytical rigor I had always applied to financial analysis. I tracked metrics on reporting rates, resolution times, employee satisfaction with the process, and cultural indicators like retention rates and engagement surveys. This data-driven approach made it possible to demonstrate the effectiveness of our interventions and secure continued support from leadership. The training programs I developed were particularly well received because they went beyond basic legal compliance to address the underlying attitudes and behaviors that enabled harassment. Instead of just telling employees what they couldn't do, we focused on building skills for creating inclusive environments where everyone could contribute their best work. One of my proudest achievements was the mentorship program I created for employees who had experienced harassment or discrimination. Participants were paired with senior employees who had successfully navigated similar challenges, providing both practical guidance and emotional support. The program was so successful that other companies began asking to replicate our model. My work began attracting attention beyond our organization. I was invited to present our policies and outcomes at industry conferences, and several major corporations hired me as a consultant to help them develop similar programs. The consulting work allowed me to influence workplace culture at companies across the country, multiplying the impact of the changes I had initiated. The National Association of Women Accountants invited me to join their board of directors, specifically to lead their initiative on workplace equality. This position gave me a platform to advocate for systemic changes across the profession and to mentor other women who were facing discrimination in their careers. I also began writing about workplace harassment and advocacy, contributing articles to professional journals and magazines. My writing combined personal experience with policy analysis, making complex legal and organizational concepts accessible to working women who needed practical guidance. Several of my articles were reprinted widely and used in diversity training programs. One particularly meaningful recognition came when I was selected to receive the Professional Courage Award from the State Bar Association's Women's Section. The award recognized my willingness to speak out about harassment despite potential professional risks and my work to help other women advocate for themselves. Receiving this recognition from the legal community validated my approach and encouraged me to continue expanding my advocacy work. My personal life also flourished during this period of professional success. Harold and I decided to move in together, combining our households and building a life that reflected our shared values and mutual support. He was incredibly proud of my achievements and often attended events where I was speaking, providing encouragement and celebrating my successes. My relationship with my children reached new depths as they watched me transform challenge into opportunity. Sarah often told people that I had taught her more about resilience and advocacy through my recent experiences than through all my previous parenting. Michael said that watching me rebuild my confidence and create positive change had inspired him to be more assertive in his own career. The financial rewards of my new position and consulting work allowed me to achieve a level of security I had never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about money, wasn't calculating whether I could afford small luxuries, wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. This financial freedom enhanced every other aspect of my life, reducing stress and increasing my ability to take risks and pursue opportunities. But perhaps the most extraordinary achievement was the transformation in my relationship with myself. The woman who had once hidden from cruel colleagues was now confidently addressing audiences of hundreds, leading organizational change initiatives, and being sought out for my expertise. I had not just recovered from the harassment, I had used it as a catalyst for achievements I never could have imagined. 2 years after accepting the director position, the scope of my impact became clear in ways that still amazed me. The company's workplace culture had transformed so dramatically that we were receiving inquiries from other organizations wanting to understand our model. Employee satisfaction scores had increased significantly, particularly among women and older workers, and our turnover rates had dropped to industry-leading levels. The most meaningful recognition came from the employees themselves. During our annual workplace climate survey, numerous respondents specifically mentioned feeling safer and more valued since the implementation of our new policies and support systems. Several women wrote detailed comments about how the changes had allowed them to focus on their work instead of worrying about harassment or discrimination. One comment that particularly moved me came from a young woman who wrote, "For the first time in my career, I feel like I can speak up when something isn't right. Knowing that there are people in leadership who understand these issues and will take them seriously has changed my entire experience at work. I'm not afraid anymore." Reading that comment, I thought about my own younger self and how different my career might have been if such support systems had existed when I was starting out. The policies I had developed weren't just preventing future harassment, they were creating opportunities for women to thrive in ways that previous generations hadn't been able to experience. The consulting work had expanded beyond individual companies to include work with professional organizations, government agencies, and educational institutions. I had helped develop workplace equity policies for organizations serving hundreds of thousands of employees across various industries. The ripple effects of this work were far-reaching and ongoing. My speaking engagements had evolved from sharing my personal story to presenting research and best practices to executive audiences. I was regularly invited to address C-suite leadership teams about the business case for inclusive workplaces, and my presentations were credited with influencing policy decisions at major corporations. The writing had also expanded beyond professional publications to include a book proposal that several publishers were interested in. The book would combine memoir elements with practical guidance, research findings, and policy recommendations. My literary agent believed it could reach audiences beyond the professional development market to inspire women dealing with various forms of discrimination. One particularly gratifying recognition came when my former harasser, Jake, requested a meeting to discuss a situation in his department. One of his employees had complained about inappropriate comments from a colleague, and Jake wanted guidance on how to handle the situation properly. The fact that he was now coming to me for advice on preventing the kind of behavior he had once engaged in demonstrated how completely the dynamics had shifted. During that meeting, I provided him with clear guidance on investigation procedures, interim protections for the complainant, and follow-up monitoring to ensure the behavior stopped. I also reminded him that his own history made it particularly important for him to take all such complaints seriously and to model appropriate behavior for his team. The academic community had also begun recognizing my work. I was invited to guest lecture at several business schools about workplace harassment, prevention, and organizational change management. These speaking opportunities allowed me to influence the next generation of business leaders and ensure that they understood these issues as core management competencies rather than peripheral concerns. A major university offered me a part-time, faculty position teaching courses on workplace equity and organizational behavior. The opportunity to formalize my expertise through academic affiliation was appealing, and it would allow me to conduct research on the effectiveness of different intervention strategies. The media attention had been largely positive, with several publications featuring my story as an example of how individuals can create systemic change. A major business magazine named me one of their Women to Watch for my work in organizational transformation, and the profile generated additional speaking opportunities and consulting inquiries. Local government officials had also taken notice of my work. I was appointed to the mayor's task force on employment discrimination, working with other advocates and experts to develop recommendations for city policy. This civic engagement allowed me to influence change beyond the private sector and to address discrimination issues affecting all workers in our community. The personal recognition was gratifying, but the real measure of success was the cultural change I could observe directly. Walking through my company's offices, I saw women of all ages and sizes moving through the spaces with confidence, participating fully in meetings, and taking up space without apology. The atmosphere of fear and exclusion that had once dominated my experience had been replaced by an environment where diverse perspectives were valued and protected. 5 years after that humiliating morning, in the break room, I stood in the same space during the company's annual celebration of Workplace Equity Month, an event I had created and now led each year. The break room had been renovated and expanded, but more importantly, it had been transformed from a place of exclusion into a space where all employees gathered comfortably for celebrations, informal meetings, and collaborative work. As I looked, around the room filled with colleagues of all ages, sizes, and backgrounds sharing food and conversation, I marveled at how completely the culture had changed. The same space where I had once been mocked and humiliated was now hosting a celebration of diversity and inclusion that I had designed and was leading. My own transformation was even more dramatic than the environmental changes around me. The woman who had once cowered at cruel comments was now a recognized expert in organizational change, a sought-after speaker and consultant, and a leader whose work was influencing workplaces across the country. I had not just survived the harassment, I had used it as a catalyst for achievements that exceeded anything I had previously imagined possible. The personal changes were as profound as the professional ones. I moved through the world with a confidence that was unshakable, because it was based not on others' approval, but on my own deep understanding of my worth and capabilities. The cruel comments that had once devastated me would now bounce off me like raindrops off a well-constructed roof. I was impervious to others' attempts to diminish me, because I knew exactly who I was and what I had accomplished. My relationship with Harold had deepened into a true partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. He had supported me through every stage of my transformation, celebrating my successes and providing comfort during the challenging moments. We had recently gotten engaged, planning a small ceremony that would celebrate not just our love, but also the journey that had brought us both to this point of happiness and fulfillment. My children had become some of my greatest advocates and sources of pride. Sarah had been so inspired by my transformation that she had taken a more active role in addressing discrimination issues in her own workplace. Michael often shared my story with friends and colleagues who were facing challenges, using my example to encourage others to advocate for themselves. The financial security I had achieved through my position and consulting work had allowed me to purchase a beautiful home in a neighborhood I had always admired but never thought I could afford. The house had a large garden where I grew vegetables and flowers, a spacious kitchen where I loved to cook for friends and family, and a home office where I worked on writing projects and prepared for speaking engagements. More importantly, I had helped create a model for organizational change that was being replicated across industries. The policies and procedures I had developed were now being used by companies, government agencies, and non-profit organizations nationwide. My work had influenced legislation in several states and had been cited in federal guidance on workplace harassment prevention. The mentorship program I had created had grown into a national network with chapters in major cities across the country. Hundreds of women had been paired with mentors who helped them navigate workplace challenges, advocate for themselves, and advance in their careers. Many of these women had gone on to become mentors themselves, creating a multiplying effect of empowerment and support. I had also established a scholarship fund for women over 40 who were returning to education or changing careers. The fund provided both financial support and mentorship, helping women develop the skills and confidence they needed to succeed in new fields. Every year, I personally met with scholarship recipients and often hired graduates for positions in my consulting practice. The book I had written about my experience and the lessons I had learned had become a bestseller in the business and self-help categories. The royalties provided additional financial security, but more importantly, the book was reaching women who might never attend my speaking engagements or work for organizations that hired me as a consultant. I received hundreds of letters from readers who said the book had helped them advocate for themselves and create positive change in their own situations. One of the most satisfying aspects of my transformation was that I had become the person I needed when I was at my lowest point. When women reached out to me for advice and support, I could provide not just sympathy, but practical strategies based on proven experience. I had become the advocate I had wished for during those dark months of harassment and isolation. The company where my journey had begun was now recognized as an industry leader in workplace equity and inclusion. Our employee satisfaction scores were consistently among the highest in our sector, our retention rates were excellent, and our reputation for fair treatment attracted top talent from competing organizations. The transformation had been so complete that new employees often found it hard to believe that the company had ever had significant harassment problems. Jake, my former tormentor, had actually become one of the most vocal supporters of our workplace equity initiatives. His transformation wasn't as dramatic as mine, but he had genuinely come to understand the harm his behavior had caused and had worked to make amends. He regularly participated in training programs and had become an example of how people could acknowledge past mistakes and commit to better behavior. The ripple effects of my transformation continued to expand in unexpected ways. Other companies began recruiting executives specifically for their expertise in creating inclusive workplaces, using the model I had developed as their standard. Business schools added courses on workplace equity to their curricula, often inviting me to guest lecture or serve on advisory committees. As I conclude this story, sitting in my beautiful home office 5 years after that devastating morning in the break room, I want to share the most important lessons I've learned from this journey. If you're a woman who is facing discrimination, harassment, or simply feeling undervalued because of your age, size, or any other characteristic that others have decided makes you a target, please hear this. You are more powerful than you know. The cruel voices that try to convince you that you're worthless, that you don't belong, that you should accept mistreatment as somehow deserved, those voices are lying. They're lying because they benefit from your silence, your acceptance, your willingness to make yourself smaller to accommodate their comfort. Every time you believe their lies, you're giving away power that rightfully belongs to you. Your worth is not determined by others' approval. Your value is not measured by whether you fit into their narrow definitions of acceptable. Your right to be treated with dignity and respect is not contingent on meeting their standards of appearance, age, or any other superficial characteristic. You matter because you exist, because you have something unique to contribute, because you deserve the same basic human respect that everyone deserves. The transformation that I experienced didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when the effort of fighting back seemed too overwhelming, when accepting their treatment seemed like the path of least resistance. But every small act of self-advocacy, every moment when I refused to accept their definition of my worth, every time I chose courage over comfort, those moments accumulated into something powerful and unstoppable. Documentation was crucial to my success, but it was more than just keeping records of harassment. It was about refusing to let them gaslight me into believing that their treatment was normal or acceptable. When you write down what happened, when you note the patterns, when you create an objective record of your experiences, you're protecting your own sanity and building the foundation for whatever action you might need to take. Building allies was equally important. I thought I was alone in my struggle, but I discovered that there were people who respected my work, valued my contributions, and were willing to support me when they understood what was happening. Don't assume that everyone shares the perspective of your harassers. Seek out the reasonable people, the fair-minded colleagues, the supportive supervisors who can help you navigate the situation. But perhaps most importantly, never forget that you have options. You don't have to accept mistreatment. You don't have to suffer in silence. You don't have to choose between your dignity and your livelihood. There are policies, laws, procedures, and people designed to protect you. Use them. They only work if we're brave enough to access them. The woman I became through this process is someone I'm genuinely proud to be. Not just because of the external achievements, the promotions, the recognition, the impact on workplace culture, but because of the internal transformation. I learned to value myself properly, to set boundaries confidently, to use my voice powerfully. I discovered strengths I didn't know I had, and developed capabilities I never thought I could possess. If my story resonates with you, if you see pieces of your own experience in what I've shared, please know that transformation is possible for you too. You don't have to become a public speaker or policy advocate to make meaningful change in your life. You just need to start with small acts of self-respect, daily choices to value yourself properly, consistent refusal to accept less than you deserve. The world needs what you have to offer. Your experience, your perspective, your talents, your wisdom. These are valuable regardless of whether others recognize that value. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't let cruel comments or systematic exclusion make you forget your own worth. Don't let their limited vision prevent you from seeing your unlimited potential. You are not too old, too fat, too anything to demand respect, pursue opportunities, and create the life you deserve. You are exactly who you need to begin your own transformation. The only question is, are you ready to stop accepting their definition of who you are and start living as the powerful woman you've always been? The choice is yours. The power is yours. The transformation is waiting for you. Your story of overcoming adversity and claiming your rightful place in this world is just beginning. Make it extraordinary. If this empowerment story touched your soul, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, share it with someone special, and write in the comments what city and country you're watching from.